printing and assembling the pattern at home, you'll need tape and paper scissors. These are actually fabric scissors, but I don't have paper scissors, so I just use these, but just for paper. And if you don't have a printer, you can print the A4 or the US letter files at a library or a print shop. If you don't want to assemble the pattern at home, there's also 2 large format versions of the pattern that you can print at a print shop. And you'll also need pins, a bodkin, which is an elastic threader, and this is a bodkin I made out of wire. If you don't have that, you can use a safety pin instead. 1-inch elastic and 1/4-inch elastic, and you'll need more than this. The exact measurements that you need for each size are in the instructions. Measuring tape. This is optional. This is a sewing and knitting gauge. I use this a lot because I like this little thing on here that comes in handy. Something to mark the fabric with. This is a pen by Pilot called Friction that disappears when you iron it. You can also use chalk. Fabric scissors, a seam ripper. This is a razor blade that I use instead of a seam ripper sometimes because it's faster, but if you use this, just be very careful. A needle for hand sewing, a loop turner, and fabric. If you are using a solid or a 4-way print like this is a 4-way print because every time you turn it, it looks the same, as opposed to stripes that are a 2-way print. You'll need about 2.5 to 3 yards for the extra small and extra large, and about 3 to 4 yards of fabric for the 1X to the 5X. Those measurements are based on a width of 44 inches, and that's assuming that you're going to be using most of the fabric while you're cutting the pattern out, as opposed to folding the fabric in one spot and laying out all of the pattern pieces in one line that are cut on fold. If you do it that way, you'll need a little bit more fabric. You also might need more fabric if you're using a 1-way print or a 2-way print, depending on how you want to lay the pattern pieces out. So keep in mind when you're buying fabric what the print looks like and also the fabric width. And I'm using 100% cotton quilting fabric that I got at a salvage store. If you can find fabric at a salvage store or a thrift store, that's great, especially if it has a natural fiber. You'll also need a sewing machine and thread. For the sewing machine, it doesn't have to be anything fancy, it just needs to stitch a straight line of stitches. And this pattern doesn't require a serger. All of the seams are French seamed. And you'll also need an iron. The first thing we're going to do is start with the front skirt. And I have one of the ruffles here. It doesn't matter which one you use because they're the same. I have the front notch cut up here. And we're going to do a double fold hem. So turn the bottom here 1/4 inch and then 1/4 inch again. Stitch along this edge and then press. Now we're going to attach the ruffle to the rest of the front skirt, and I have the notches cut out at the top on the side for the waistband, and then I have a notch cut out here for the center front. And what we're going to do is gather this ruffle so it fits into the skirt. And there's a few different ways you can do that. You can, with your sewing machine, loosely stitch a line of stitches and then pull the thread to gather this, or you can use a needle and thread and hand baste a line of stitches. What I like to do is use a 1/4 inch elastic to create the gathers, and I reuse this elastic over and over again for gathers like this that aren't functional, that don't need to stretch. So what I'm going to do is measure the bottom of the skirt where we're attaching the ruffle with the elastic. And then I take off 1/2 inch just because the elastic does stretch a little bit. And I'm just going to pin it to the end of the ruffle. And then I'm going to fold this in half to find the middle. And then I'm going to pin the middle section of the elastic to the center front notch. I'm attaching the elastic to the very edge of the ruffle. And then I'm going to pin the elastic to the other side. I'm going to pin it about 1 inch down so there's room to start sewing. While I'm sewing this, I'm going to stretch out the elastic to create the gather. The ruffle's done, and now we're going to attach the ruffle to the skirt using a French seam. So I'm just going to turn this over because we're going to pin the wrong sides of the fabric together. And just make sure that your front notches are matched up. I like to pin the notches together, and then the two ends, and then pin the rest. After you finish pinning, you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and just make sure that you don't sew onto the elastic because we're going to take that off after. I have the elastic attached to the skirt. Hopefully yours looks something like this, with the seam allowance on the outside. And now we're going to take this elastic off using a seam ripper. Or what I like to do is use a razor blade because it is a little bit faster. You just have to be careful not to cut yourself or the fabric. So I suggest practicing a little bit before if you're going to use this method. I'm going to take all of the little threads out of the elastic so I can use it again. Now I'm going to press this top edge and trim off the seam allowance so there's about 1/8 of an inch left. To finish the French seam, I'm going to turn this over and press this top edge so that it's even, and sew 1/4 of an inch in from the edge. Normally I would press the seam allowance down, but because this is a French seam with a ruffle, it naturally wants to go up, so I'm going to press the seam allowance up. Now we're going to do the waistband. So at this notch up here, we're going to turn this over and then pin it in a few places and press. While I'm pinning it, I'm going to make sure that it's even the whole way across. And then once that's pressed, we're going to turn it at this notch, repin it, press, and then edge stitch along here. Press the waistband. I have my waistband elastic, and then I have another one for the back. For the length of the elastic, you can follow the suggestions on the instructions, or you can measure your waist and just cut that in half. So if your waist is 30, you could just cut 2 15-inch pieces of elastic. I don't add extra for the seam allowance just because it's nice if it has a little bit of a snug fit. If it's your exact waist and then you add seam allowance, it might be too loose. So just double check and make sure that the fit is comfortable for whatever elastic you're using. I have a 1-inch non-roll elastic, and I'm going to pin it at the end with a safety pin and then tunnel it through. And then I'm going to pin it at each end and then kind of tack it about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. I'm going to sew like along there just so it stays in place until we attach the back skirt. So even though I'm using a non-roll elastic and the sides are tacked, I'm going to add another little tack in the middle, and I'm going to use a needle and thread to do that. I'm going to go in through the bottom here and come up. So the needle right now is only going through the elastic and then this fabric. Then I'm holding this back so it doesn't go through. I'm going to add a couple of little stitches. Then I'm going to come back out through the bottom and tie a couple of knots. Okay, so now that that's tacked, the elastic shouldn't roll at all, and the front skirt's done. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing to the back skirt, and then I'll show you how to attach the two together. I have both the front and the back skirt done now, and I'm going to attach the two together using a French seam. So put the wrong sides together and pin. Make sure that the seam allowance here at the ruffle is pointed up, and then sew 1/4 of an inch all the way down, and then trim off the seam allowance. Now I'm going to turn the skirt to the other side, and then I'm going to press and make sure that this seam is flat, and then stitch 1/4 of an inch all along there. Once the other side is finished, press both side seams. Now the skirt is done, and you can tell the back from the front by looking at the hem. And as you can see, the back is slightly longer. Now we're going to do the bodice, and I have the front bodice piece here with the 3 notches at each side for the elastic tunnel, the center front notch at the top, and these 2 notches that mark where it's going to be gathered at the top there. I'm going to attach the front facing for the slit first. So we'll put the right sides together and then use the pattern piece to transfer the stitch line onto the facing. I'm going to take the pattern piece and fold it at the bottom of the stitch line and place it at the top here. And then I'm going to mark the bottom. I'm using a pen by Pilot called Friction. I always want to say Frixion, but I'm pretty sure that's not how you say it. But you can use chalk or pencil. It doesn't really matter because this isn't going to show up anyway. But I do like this pen for sewing because it just irons off, which is nice. Unless if it's cold out, then it comes back and you just have to put it through the wash to get it completely out. But anyway, we're now going to mark the top where those two lines are, and then just connect them to the bottom. And then we're just going to sew right along this line. And on my sewing machine, I have the length set to 4, I think. It's like the longest stitch, and it just does like 1 stitch here, if that's helpful. Now we're going to cut a slit in between these 2 stitches, and when you get to the bottom, just cut a little slit towards each corner so it looks like a little Y. Now we're going to press the facing over to the other side, fold in the seam allowance, pin it, and then stitch along the edge. So I'm just folding here to the stitch line and then folding it over again. And while I'm stitching, I'm going to be stitching along this edge and I'll be removing the pins. Press both sides of the facing. Now we're going to do the bottom part of the bodice, and the hem has a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So we're going to turn this over. It's going to be a baby fold hem. And so you'll turn it over. It's technically 3/16 of an inch, but I like to just think of it as a little under a quarter. And so you'll turn it once and then turn it again and then edge stitch. Press the hem, and then where these 3 notches are, you're going to match the top and the bottom notch so that they're touching, and then this other middle notch is at the top, and you're going to pin that there. And then you're going to do the same thing on the other side. Now we're going to measure one of the ends and then make sure this is folded over at the same width all along here. And then we're going to put a few pins in, and then where this notch is, that's your marker for where to sew the tunnel. So you'll go all the way down there. And then press before you sew. Basically just press everything before and after you do anything. Press this tunnel up and then edge stitch along the top of the tunnel. Press the tunnel. And now I have 2 elastics cut out for the waistband. This is for the front and back waistband. They're exactly the same. And this is a 1/4 inch elastic. You can either follow the suggestions again on the instructions, or you can measure your own waist, which I kind of suggest doing anyway, because elastics, they have, different stretches, and some are softer and some are harder than others. And the way that I figured out the measurement for my own waist was I took the elastic and put it around my waist as if I was measuring it with a measuring tape. And then I added 1 3/4 inches for the seam allowance. And then I took that and then cut the elastic and then cut it in half. So it's a little bit different from the waistband measurement because that fits a little bit more snug, and I want this to have a slightly looser fit than that. So I'm going to take a safety pin that's pretty sturdy and tunnel the elastic through. And then I'm going to pin it on each end and then tack it down again, like how it was on the waistband. And I'm tacking it from about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch in from the edge. Okay, now I'm going to make sure that the gathers look pretty even. And then I'm going to put this aside and work on the back bodice. I have the notch cut out at the top of the center back, and then I have the 3 notches cut out at the side. And then I'm going to do the same thing I just did to the front bodice to the hem of this. So I'm going to start with the baby fold hem. Flip this over and then take the front bodice and attach the side seams using a French seam. So we're going to place the wrong sides together, pin them, and then sew 1/4 of an inch down, and then trim off the seam allowance. Now flip this to the other side and press the seam down and then sew 1/4 of an inch in, and then repeat the same thing on the other side. Okay, now I'm going to put the bodice aside, and we're going to take the front bodice ruffles and attach them to the back bodice ruffle. I have the center back notches cut at the top and the bottom of the back ruffle. What we're going to do is take the right sides and put them together and then pin and sew them together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So we'll sew along there, and then I'm going to attach the front ruffle to the other side of the back ruffle. And it ends up making one long strip that's going to be gathered. Press the seam allowance out. And then at the front, turn it in a 1/2 inch and press. And then do the same thing to the other side. And then fold this whole strip in half and stitch it along the edge here, all the way down. Press the ruffle. I have here one of the bodice facing pieces, and I made sure that the center back notches are cut there. And then I have 2 notches over here for the side seam, and then 2 notches over here for the side seam. And just going to fold over the edge a 1/2 inch and then press. I'm going to do that for both sides. And I'm just going to flip this over and take the ruffle piece, and this ruffle is going to be gathered so that it fits onto this facing. And you can use whatever gathering method you like. I'm going to use the elastic method again. And just so you know, this seam here, that's the side seam, and that's going to be matched up with this side seam notch. And then the center back notch here in the middle of the ruffle, that'll be matched up with this notch. And then this other seam is going to be matched up with the side seam over here. So I already measured out this elastic. So it's the length of the facing with the sides turned in, because this is the length we want it to be for this ruffle once it's gathered. But I'm just going to take off another inch. because this is going to stretch out, and it's better if this ruffle is a little bit shorter than this, than longer, because you can easily just stretch it out while the elastic is sewn onto it. And so I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to pin and stitch down the elastic about 1/4 of an inch from this raw edge. And then I'm going to fold the elastic in half to find the middle. And then pin this to where the center back notch is. And then pin this other end. About 1 inch down, so I have a place to start sewing. And then I'm going to pull this elastic while I'm sewing, and it'll gather the ruffle. Pin the ruffle to the facing by pinning the ends first and the notches. So I'm just going to find the seam here and match that up with this side seam notch. And make sure that the ruffle isn't twisted in the wrong way. And then I'm going to find the center back notch on here and match it with the notch on the facing. And then the seam here is going with that notch. Then I'm going to put a lot of pins so the ruffle stays flat and also flush with the edge of the facing. I'm going to sew these together now by sewing along here right next to the elastic, and this is to hold the ruffle in place to here to make it a little bit easier when we sew the other facing on. So I'm going to do that and then seam rip this elastic off and then take all the threads out of it again. Press the ruffle. And take the other facing piece and fold in each end a 1/2 inch. Now we're going to put the right sides together and match up the notches with each other, pin, and then sew a 1/2 inch away from the raw edge. And while you're sewing, this piece might stretch out a little bit, but that's fine. You can readjust when you get to the end. So I'll show that to you if that happens. It might end up being like that. As you can see, this has stretched out a little bit, so I'm just going to refold it so that it matches up with the ruffle and the other facing. Press and then trim off the seam allowance so there's about 1/8 inch left. As a side note, this is one of the fit samples I did, and I used this fabric that's pretty loosely woven. And if you're using a fabric that's loosely woven like this, you'll want to leave about a 1/4 inch seam allowance instead of 1/8, because as you can see here, the threads started coming undone, and that's because the seam allowance was too short and it just ripped out. So don't do that. I'm using quilting fabric that's 100% cotton, so that's not really an issue. Flip the facing over so it looks like this, and then press. Fold this top edge in a 1/2 inch so this raw edge is touching that stitch line, and fold it like that, and then press all the way down. Now on the other side, you're going to do the same thing, but make sure that these two edges match up well with each other and then pin them together. The top of the bodice is going to be inserted into the facing, so I'm going to mark a few places on the facing that are going to be matched up with the bodice. So I'm going to put a pin on here for the side seam, and it's where the seam is in the ruffle. That's going to be matched up with the side seam, and then going to measure 3 inches over. And that marks where this is going to be inserted from here to here. This is going to be gathered, and then it'll go into the facing. And then from this pin to the side seam, the bodice is going to go in and it'll be flat there. And then going to measure over 3 inches from the side seam and put a pin. And so from the side seam to that pin, that'll be flat. And then from here over to where the other pin is on this other side that we'll put in, that'll be gathered. And I'm going to fold this in half to find the center back. And so the center back there, that'll be matched up with this center back notch. And then I'm going to go to this side and do the same thing I did to the other side. So I'm putting a pin where the seam is at the ruffle, that's the side seam. And then I'm measuring over 3 inches from the side seam at each side. So the back from this notch, and it goes to the center back, and then it goes to this notch over here. That's going to be gathered in from here to here. And then that's the center back notch. So the way that I'm going to do the gathering is by using the elastic again. And if it's easier for you, you can use a thread and needle and hand-based a line of stitches. I like using the elastic because it makes the gathers perfectly even, and I get frustrated when I do the needle and thread hand basting method myself, because then I have to manually spread these out, and I'm usually not happy with how it looks. But if you're good at it, do it that way, because it's, I think, a little bit easier. Or I don't know, maybe this way is, I don't know. So what I'm going to do is measure from here to the first pin with the elastic, and then I'm going to take off an inch from that, about an inch from that measurement. I'm going to pin at the edge where the notch is, and then I'm going to pin this over here. And then I'll be sewing this stretched out. And the reason why I took off an inch is because after this elastic is attached to the bodice, I'm going to go and sew a line of stitches right next to the elastic to hold the gathers in, and then I'll take the elastic off. And when that happens, when you're sewing next to the elastic, the gathers get kind of flattened out, and that's why I took off some length from the elastic. So it might be a little bit shorter than this, but it's easier to take out some of the stitches and then make it a little bit longer than trying to shove everything in there, which is fine too. So I'm going to do that for the other side as well. And then I'm going to do the back too. So I'm going to, do this side, doing this and then that, and then the back. And then the rest of wherever the elastic is, that's not shirred, so we won't deal with that now. And I'm going to measure this. So I'm going to put a little pin to mark. And I'm going to take off about 1.5 inches. So from there to there, I'm going to find the middle, match that up with a center back notch. And then this pin goes where this notch is. Okay, so now I'm going to sew each section. I'm going to sew over the elastic and then next to the elastic, and then I'm going to take the elastic off. Okay, the 3 sections are gathered, and I'm going to double check and see if they match. And so put the notch up with here, and this one's a little bit short, so I'm going to take a few stitches out and spread this out a little bit. And this one, this side matches up well. And then the back, that matches up. I'm going to first match up the notches and the side seams together and pin them, and then pin the rest by taking a few pins out at a time and putting this in. So this raw edge is touching the seam in here. So it'll be like that. And then when you repin, make sure that this edge of the facing and this edge are both level, and you can feel that with your fingers. And then pin the bottom of the facing. And after this is pinned, we'll be stitching along there. And while you're pinning, make sure that the pin is going through the facing in the back here and not coming out below where the bodice is. So I'm going to match this notch up with this pin. And then the side seam up with the next pin there. And I'm making sure that the side seam allowance is pointed towards the back. And then this notch is going to be matched up with the pin up here. The center back notch will be matched up with this pin. And then this notch with that pin. And then that's the side seam. And then this notch goes with this pin. And then over here, to make this fit in, I'm going to take out a couple of stitches, or just one. Okay, that worked. And now I'm going to go around and put a bunch of pins in so this stays in place until it's sewn. Now I'm going to go around and look at the inside and make sure that the pins are all on the facing and that the bodice isn't hanging out anywhere. And it looks fine. So I'm going to press this and then top stitch along the very edge of the facing. And I like to start at the side seam and then go to the front because it tends to look nicer if I do it that way than when I start at the front. I tend to sometimes mess things up here. And so I'm going to go from there to there and then start again at the side seam and go all the way around to the other front. After you sew the facing on, go around and make sure that the bodice isn't falling out in any places and that the stitching looks even. And then press the facing. Now we're going to work on the sleeves, and I have the sleeve piece here with the 3 notches cut out there and there. And on this edge that's closer to the notches, we're going to do baby fold hem. So we're going to turn it over 3/16 of an inch and then again, and then stitch along that edge. Press the hem, and then where these 3 notches are, going to create a tunnel like how the tunnel was done on the bodice. So I'm going to match the top notch to the bottom notch. So the center one is at the top there once it's folded. And then I'm going to do that to the other side. Then I'm going to make sure that this is folded over at the same width, and then pin it and press, and then at this notch, sew a stitch all along there. Now we're going to press the tunnel up and edge stitch all along the top. Press the tunnel and then turn over the top of the sleeve 1/4 of an inch and pin it so it stays in place, and then press. Now we're going to turn over the edge again, 7/8 of an inch, pin it, and then press again. To create the tunnel at the top of the sleeve, we're going to add 2 rows of stitches. So we'll add 1 row of stitches along the edge here where the pin is, and then a 1/2 inch in from the edge of the sleeve we'll add another row of stitches. Before adding the second row of stitches, I'm going to press the top. Press the tunnel, and now we're going to put a 1/4 inch elastic into the upper tunnel, and you can either use the suggestions on the instructions for the length, or you can measure your arm, which I recommend doing anyway, just to double check and make sure that the elastic's going to be comfortable for you. And the way that I figured out the length of this is I measured my bicep and then I added 1.75 inches extra to that length. And I did that for the seam allowance, and also it needs a little bit extra because it's going to be stitched to the bodice and you want a little bit extra length so you can move your arm around. And then the length for the bottom elastic is going to be 1 inch shorter than this elastic. Now I'm going to thread the elastic, and instead of using a safety pin, because this is a pretty long tunnel, I'm using a homemade bodkin or elastic threader. And I'd add a piece of wire, and I left this end straight, and then I turned this so it made a loop, and I have the end pointing this way so that it doesn't snag while I'm threading. And I'm going to put the elastic through and pin. The safety pin, it works fine, it takes a little bit longer, so I'm going to use this for the sleeves. Now I'm going to tack the elastic about 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch in from the edge. Now we're going to do a French seam. So we're going to put the wrong sides together, pin, and then sew 1/4 inch down, and then trim off the seam allowance. Now we're going to flip this inside out, press the seam, and then sew 1/4 inch again. Now we're going to attach the sleeve to the bodice. So we're going to turn to the side seam here and find the seam on the sleeve and match it up with the side seam. The bottom of the sleeve is the side that has the longer ruffle on it. And I'm going to put a pin where the seams are. And then on the bodice, I'm going to measure over 2 inches and put a pin there. And then stretch the sleeve out a little bit and pin it to where that pin is. And I'm going to do that on the other side of the pin. Go over 2 inches. Now to attach the sleeve to the bodice, I'm going to sew a rectangle. So I'm going to start at this pin and sew right along the edge, the top edge here, and make sure that this seam allowance is pointed towards the back. And then once I get to this pin, I'm going to turn and go down and stitch along this line here, back to this pin, and then go back up. And before and after every corner, I'm going to backstitch to reinforce the sleeve and make sure that it won't rip off. The stitching on the sleeve should look like this. And now I'm going to go and repeat the same process for the sleeve on the other side. Both sleeves are now done, and I'm going to put that aside and do the bodice tie. So instead of attaching these together and creating one long tie that I then turn inside out with a loop turner, I'm going to do each of these one at a time because it's a little bit easier to turn inside out. So for one of these, I'm going to turn in both ends 1/2 inch and press. And then I'm only going to turn in one end of the other one 1/2 inch. And I'm doing that because once this is turned inside out and it's a tie, this raw edge is going to be inserted into this tie, and then we'll stitch these two together right there. But that's for later. Okay, now going to fold both of these in half so that the right sides are touching, and then sew a 1/2 inch all the way down. Trim off the seam allowance so there's 1/8 of an inch left. I'm going to use a loop turner to turn each tie inside out. I'm just going to use the end of a tapestry needle to kind of fix each end of the tie and make sure this raw edge is all out and not folded in. Then press each tie. Before I attach the two ties together, I'm going to measure them and see how much they stretched out, because depending on the fabric you used, they most likely stretched out while using the loop turner. So I'm going to start with the tie that has the two finished edges, and I have my bodice tie pattern piece here, and I'm going to fold under the seam allowance. So I'm folding under a 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to measure this tie. The tie should be double the length of this pattern piece, and it stretched out this much. So for now, I'm going to put a pin marking where the extra length is. And then going to measure the other tie. And for the second half of this other tie, I'm going to unfold the seam allowance. I cut this part off earlier, so just pretend that's still attached. Okay, and so this is this extra long. So we're going to want to cut off this and then cut off this length here. And so now the tie will be the correct length, and you can double check it by measuring that. And then there'll be a 1/2 inch overlap over here. There. I'm going to insert the raw edge of this tie into the other tie, and I'm going to do that by taking a normal needle with thread and just going to go through this a few times on the raw edge tie. I'm using about 10 inches of thread, and I'm going to insert the needle into the tie that has the finished end, and then I'm going to go up like 1 inch and then take the needle out. And then just pull the thread so that the tie goes into the other one. Once the tie is in about 1/2 inch, you can snip the thread. The tie will look like this, and I'm going to stitch along this edge and then also a 1/2 inch in where the tie ends on the inside over here, just to make sure that these stay together very well, because this tie is what holds the bodice up, so this seam needs to be pretty strong. I'm going to use my bodkin to thread the tie through the tunnel. Now tie a bow. And you're done! Yay!